The sun was a hammer, and the land was an anvil. Gideon Ashford figured he was being forged into something mean and hard, or maybe just boiled down to bone and dust. He pulled his horse, Buck, to a halt. The stream he was following had died a month ago, leaving a bleached skeleton of rock twisting through the scrub. His canteen was mostly air. His head was pounding. But he'd seen something. Not a trick of the heat, not a ghost. It was a shape, slumped by the dry creek bed. A heap of cloth and hair that didn't belong. He swung out of the saddle, his boots crunching on the brittle earth. Every step was deliberate. You didn't rush things out here. Rushing got you bit, or shot, or lost forever. It was a woman. Dust was caked onto her dress like a second skin, the hem torn into ribbons. Her hair was a tangled mess, stuck to her neck. She was on her knees, hands limp in her lap, like a puppet with its strings cut. Her lips were cracked and her eyes were open, but saw nothing. She looked like she'd already given up and her body just hadn't gotten the message. Gideon uncapped his canteen, the slosh of the last few sips sounding loud as a gunshot in the silence. He knelt. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Here. Drink." Her eyes didn't move. He wondered if he was too late. He pressed the metal lip of the canteen to her mouth. She didn't flinch. He tilted it. Water dribbled over her chin, tracing a clean line through the grime. Then she blinked. Her throat worked. She swallowed. Her eyes, dull as river stones, flickered and seemed to find him. She drank, a few small sips at first, then a desperate, choking gulp. He pulled the canteen away before she could make herself sick. She stared at him, really seeing him this time. Her voice was pure sandpaper. "Thank you." "I'm Gideon Ashford," he said. "You got a name?" She nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. "Selene," she whispered. "Selene Lowell." He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "All right, Selene. You alone out here?" Her gaze dropped to her hands. "My wagon broke, 2 days back. My brother, he rode for help, never came back." She swallowed hard. "I started walking, thought I'd find water." "You found a dry stream," he said, keeping his voice gentle. A flicker of something sharp crossed her face. "I figured that out." Even exhausted and half dead, she had a fire in her. It was a small thing, but it settled something in his chest. This one was a fighter. "Well," Gideon said, standing up and offering her a hand. "You found me too. Come on. My horse can carry us both. Got a camp not far." "I can walk." "Not in that state. You can't." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face, looking for the catch. Finding none, she gave a single nod. He helped her to her feet. She was light, terrifyingly light, as if the desert had already started to consume her from the inside out. She swayed, and he caught her, his arm instinctively going around her waist to hold her steady. She went rigid. A jolt went through her like he'd burned her. Then, just as quickly, she sagged against him, a silent admission that she had nothing left to fight with. "I'm not going to let you fall," he said, and the words felt like a promise he didn't know he was making. They rode in silence, her back pressed against his chest. He could feel the shallow rhythm of her breathing. His camp was nothing much, just a tarp strung between 2 boulders, but it offered shade, and out here, shade was life itself. He set her down gently and gave her the last of his hard crackers. She ate them slowly with a grim purpose that told him more about her than her words had. "You a rancher?" she asked after a while, her voice a little stronger. "Used to be," he said, staring into the distance. "Up near Prescott. Lost the herd last winter. Lost the land right after. And now? Now I drift," he said simply. "Work where I find it." She looked at him then, a long, searching look. "You helped me. Gave me your last water, your last food. Seemed the right thing to do. You didn't know me." He met her gaze. "That's never mattered much." Her eyes glistened for a second before she turned away. He didn't press. He just let her be. That night, as they sat by a small fire, she finally spoke of her brother again. "His name was Cobb," she said, staring into the flames. I think he's gone." He didn't ask how she knew. Some things you just felt in your bones. "I'm sorry." She nodded. "We came west after my husband passed. A fever. Took him before we even had a child." Her mouth tightened into a thin, hard line. "I've had to start over too many times." Gideon knew that feeling. The weight of it. The way it grinds you down until you're not sure you can get back up. "You don't need to start over tonight," he said. "Just rest." She looked at him again, and for the first time a real smile touched her lips. It was small, and it looked like it hurt. But it was there, and it hit him with the force of a physical blow. He took the first watch, letting her sleep. In the gray light of dawn, she looked better. The color was returning to her cheeks. Her eyes were clearer. She helped him pack without being asked, her movements economical and sure. "Where will you go now?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, and her voice was flat. "There's no one left waiting for me." "There's work in Tucson," he offered, the words coming out before he'd really thought them through. "I was heading that way. You could come with me, just till you get your feet under you." She looked at him, suspicion warring with desperation in her eyes. "You sure?" "Wouldn't offer if I wasn't." She nodded. "All right." The ride to Tucson took 3 days, 3 days of shared silence and short conversations. He learned she was from Kansas. He learned she liked the way the stars looked in a sky with no city lights. He learned that her quiet laugh, when it finally came, was a sound he wanted to hear again. On the 4th morning, she handed him a cup of coffee and said, "I feel like I can breathe again." Something inside him, something he thought had long since turned to dust, shifted. "I like hearing your voice," he said. Her cheeks flushed and she looked down into her cup. "I like talking to you." "Then keep doing it," he said with a small smile. That afternoon, as they rode through a shallow valley, she reached out and touched his arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, "for stopping. I wouldn't have made it." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then back up at her face. "I didn't stop just because you needed help, Selene." She looked puzzled. "Why then?" "I stopped because something in me needed to," he said, the truth of it surprising even himself. She didn't say anything else. She just leaned a little closer as they rode, and the silence that fell between them was no longer empty. It was full of something new, something just beginning. But Gideon had been alone for a long time, and he knew that things that start in the desert often have a way of disappearing like a mirage. He pushed the thought away. For now, she was real, and that was enough. As they drew closer to Tucson, the land turning a deeper shade of red, a change came over Selene. She sat up straighter, her eyes scanning the horizon not with the lost look of a survivor, but with the sharp focus of a hunter. The weakness that had clung to her like a shroud was gone, replaced by a coiled tension he couldn't quite name. One evening, as he laid strips of venison on a hot rock by the fire, she spoke. "Tell me about Prescott," she said, "the woman you were set to marry." It wasn't an idle question. Her tone was pointed, specific. He paused. "Her name was Clara. She left in the spring. Said she couldn't watch everything fall apart again." "She didn't like the land," Selene stated, not asked. "No. Said it was too empty to build anything on." Selene stared into the fire. "She was wrong," she said softly. "It's not empty. It's just quiet. You have to listen for its strength, same as people." He looked at her. Really looked at her. The firelight carved shadows under her cheekbones. Her eyes were dark, and they held secrets he was only just beginning to suspect. She was strong, all right. but it was the strength of tempered steel, folded and beaten in a fire he couldn't imagine. Later that night, as they lay under the stars, she asked, "You plan on staying in Tucson long?" "Hadn't planned much past getting you there," he admitted. She turned her head to face him, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. "What if I wanted to stay near you?" His breath caught in his throat. "I wouldn't mind that." Her hand found his in the dark, her fingers cool and firm. He laced his own with hers, a silent agreement passing between them. But the next day, as a mule-drawn wagon passed them on the trail, the driver tipped his hat. "Howdy, folks. Heading to town?" Gideon nodded. "Best be careful," the driver said, his eyes lingering on Selene for a beat too long. "Sheriff's been asking after a woman traveling alone. Said her brother from back in Kansas reported her missing. Said she took off with the family savings." Gideon felt Selene stiffen beside him. He kept his face neutral. "Appreciate the warning." The wagon rattled on, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence. Gideon didn't look at her. He didn't have to. The story she'd told him, the story of a broken wagon and a lost brother, had just crumbled into dust. She wasn't a victim he'd saved. He was riding with a thief, and they were heading straight into the town where a lawman was waiting for her. Gideon kept his eyes on the trail ahead, the reins loose in his hands. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He could feel her watching him, waiting for him to speak, to accuse her. He didn't give her the satisfaction. Finally, she broke. "It's not what you think, isn't it?" he asked, his voice flat. "Seems pretty simple. You lied to me." "I had to," she said, her voice tight with a desperation that sounded real. "My brother Calb. He wasn't my brother. He was my husband." Gideon's jaw tightened. Another lie to cover the first one. "He wasn't a good man, Gideon," she went on, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He gambled away our farm. Took every cent my father left me. When I told him I was leaving, he locked me in the cellar. Said if he couldn't have me, no one would. I escaped. I took what little money he hadn't found, and I ran." She was looking at him now, her eyes pleading. "The story about him going for help, I made it up. I had to have a reason for being alone, a reason a man like you would believe, a reason you would help." He thought back to how she'd looked when he found her. The vacant eyes, the utter exhaustion. That hadn't been a lie. The fear that had jolted through her when he touched her waist, that was real too. "So the sheriff in Tucson?" "Calb must have sent word ahead," she whispered. "He's telling everyone I robbed him. He's twisting it. He's hunting me." They rode on, the lights of Tucson now a faint, hopeful flicker on the horizon. It should have been a welcome sight. Instead, it felt like riding into a cage. He had a choice. He could turn her over to the law, wash his hands of it. Or he could trust the woman who had lied to his face from the moment they met. He looked over at her. She was watching the lights of the town, her expression a mixture of fear and a grim determination that sent a shiver down his spine. She wasn't just running from something, she was running to something. And he was beginning to realize that getting her feet under her wasn't her plan at all. As they reached the edge of town, he reined Buck in. "You sure this is the road you want?" he asked, his voice low. She met his gaze, her eyes hard and clear. "It's the only one I've got." He squeezed her hand, a gesture that was more about reassuring himself than her. "Then we ride it together." Tucson was a town swelling with false hope and real dirt. New timber frames stood next to sagging adobes, and the streets were a chaotic mess of freight wagons, miners, and men with restless eyes. The railroad was coming, and it had kicked over the anthill. Gideon found work hauling timber for the new depot. The work was brutal, but the pay was honest. Selene, to his surprise, didn't hide. She walked straight into the millinery shop run by a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Dobbins and asked for a job. By the end of the day, she was hired, her fine stitching skills earning her a small wage and a measure of protection under the watchful eye of the town's matriarch. They rented a small room above the saddlery. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And in that small room, a fragile trust began to grow. They moved around each other with a quiet understanding, their routines weaving together. He never mentioned her husband. She never mentioned the lie. It was a silent pact between them. But Gideon watched. He saw the way she'd pause when a man with Kolb's build walked past on the street. He saw how her hands would tremble slightly after reading the notices posted outside the sheriff's office. She wasn't just hiding. She was waiting. One night, he came back to the room, bone-weary and smelling of pine dust. She had a basin of hot water waiting. As she washed the grime from the back of his neck with a soft cloth, she spoke. "Mrs. Dobbins asked me today if we were married." He grunted. "What did you tell her?" "I said we were planning on it." His hand stopped, halfway to unlacing his boots. He looked at her. Her face was calm, her eyes steady. It wasn't a question or a proposal. It was a statement, a move on a chessboard he was only just learning the rules to. "Is that so?" he said quietly. "A lone woman is vulnerable," she said, her gaze unwavering. "A married woman has a husband to stand for her, to protect her. The sheriff is less likely to bother a respectable married couple." He understood then. This wasn't about love, it was about survival, a shield, and he was it. The old, cynical part of him wanted to be angry, to feel used. But looking at her, at the quiet strength holding her together, he couldn't find it in him. "All right," he said. "All right. We'll get married." A week later, a letter arrived, postmarked from Kansas. Seleni's hands shook as she opened it. Gideon watched her face go pale, then harden into a mask of stone. "Bad news?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She folded the letter with precise, deliberate movements. "It's from a neighbor," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "They found Kalb outside a saloon in Socorro. He got into a card game with the wrong men. They found him in an alley with a knife in his ribs." Gideon felt a wave of relief so strong it almost buckled his knees. It was over. The threat was gone. She was free. He stepped behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "He can't hurt you any more, Seleni." She reached up and covered his hand with hers, but her shoulders were rigid. She didn't lean back into him. She just stared at the wall. "No," she whispered, and her voice was terrifyingly calm. "He can't. He thought this would be the end of it, the end of the fear. He thought now they could start something real. He was wrong. The threat of her husband was gone, but the shadow he cast remained. In fact, it grew longer, because a few nights later, Gideon woke up to an empty bed. The room was cold. He sat up, his heart pounding. He saw her standing by the window, a silhouette against the moonlit street. She was holding something. A small, leather-bound book, her journal. She was whispering to herself, her back to him. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling. It wasn't the sound of grief. It was the sound of a vow. And then she turned, and in the sliver of moonlight from the window, he saw the look on her face. It was a look he'd seen before, on the faces of men who had lost everything and had nothing left but revenge. Her husband was dead. But she wasn't free. She was still hunting, and Kalb hadn't been her target. He'd just been the first obstacle. The wedding was on a Tuesday at dawn, performed by a traveling preacher with whiskey on his breath. Seleni wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself. Gideon wore a clean shirt. Mrs. Dobbins stood as their witness, weeping softly into a lace handkerchief. Gideon slid a plain brass ring onto Seleni's finger. Her hand was cold, but steady. She looked him right in the eye as the preacher mumbled the final words, her expression unreadable. To anyone watching, they were a young couple starting a new life. Gideon knew better. They were forging an alliance. Afterward, back in their small room, she folded her napkin and said, "I used to think I'd never feel safe again." "You are now," he said, playing his part. "I know," she replied, and a small, tight smile touched her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. With the immediate threat of Calb gone, and with the legal shield of marriage, Selene changed. The fear that had haunted her edges was replaced by a sharp, focused energy. She wasn't just working at the millinery anymore, she was listening. She gathered gossip from the ranchers' wives and the miners' daughters, piecing together the movements of every new face that came into town. Gideon continued his work at the rail yard, but he felt like a stranger in his own life. He was living with a woman whose true purpose was a mystery to him. He'd find her at night, poring over old newspapers she'd bought from a freight hauler, her finger tracing names and dates. She was searching for a ghost. One evening, he confronted her. "Calb is dead, Selene. Who are you looking for?" She looked up from a shipping manifest, her eyes dark. "Calb didn't ruin us on his own," she said, her voice low and venomous. "He had a partner. A man who came to Kansas with a silver tongue and pockets full of promises. He told Calb about a land deal out west. A sure thing. He convinced my husband to invest everything we had. My inheritance." She stood up and paced the small room like a caged wolf. "It was all a lie. The land was worthless. The partner disappeared with every dollar. He left Calb with nothing but debt and rage. Calb took that rage out on me. The man who did this, he didn't just steal our money. He stole my life. He's the one who truly put me in that cellar." "What was his name?" Gideon asked, his gut twisting into a cold knot. Selene stopped pacing and looked at him. "He used many names, but the one he used in Kansas was Silas Kane." Gideon felt the blood drain from his face. The room suddenly felt small, the air too thin to breathe. He stumbled back and sat on the edge of the bed, the frame groaning under his weight. Silas Kane, a name from a past he had buried deep, a ghost he had spent 5 years trying to outrun. Selene saw the look on his face. Her eyes narrowed. "You know him." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "He was my partner," Gideon choked out, the words tasting like ash. "Before Prescott, before everything, we ran cattle together until he—" He couldn't finish. The memory was too sharp. The fire, the brandished gun, the herd that wasn't theirs, the man Silas had shot in the back, the deputy's badge Gideon had thrown into a river a week later, unable to live with the shame of letting Silas get away. Selene stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief, slowly hardening into fury. "You were his partner?" "I didn't know what he was," Gideon insisted, his voice pleading. "Not until it was too late. I was the one who was supposed to bring him in. I tracked him for months, but he vanished." "He didn't vanish," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "He went to Kansas. He found my husband. He destroyed my life. And you just let him go." The foundation of their life, the fragile trust built on shared survival and unspoken truths, shattered into a million pieces. She wasn't just a woman he'd rescued. He wasn't just a drifter who had helped her. They were bound together by the same man. She saw him as a failure, a coward, part of the sickness that had ruined her. And he realized the horrible truth. Selene hadn't been running from Calb. She'd been hunting Silas. She had come to Tucson for a reason, and it wasn't for the work. It was because the railroad, the very thing that had brought Gideon here, was Silas Kane's latest venture. He was here, in this town. And Gideon had just led the woman sworn to destroy Silas right to his doorstep. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick with betrayal. Selene looked at him as if he were a stranger, a monster. To her, he was just another part of the lie that had cost her everything. "All this time," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Our marriage. It was all built on his shadow. I didn't know, Selene. Gideon pleaded. I swear to you, I've been running from him as much as you have. Running? She scoffed, a bitter, broken sound. I haven't been running. I've been hunting. Every step I took, every day I survived was to find him, to make him pay. She crossed the room and grabbed her small bag, stuffing her few belongings into it with frantic, angry movements. What are you doing? He asked, his heart seizing with panic. I'm finishing this, she said, her eyes burning with a cold fire he'd never seen before. Alone. You can't face him by yourself, Selene. He's not just a con man, he's a killer. And what will you do? She shot back, whirling to face him. Throw another badge in a river? He's built a life here. He's a respected man. Look around you, Gideon. He's the foreman of the rail yard. He's your boss. The words hit him like a physical blow. The friendly, competent foreman who had given him a job, who had offered him a plot of land. It was Silas. He had been working for Silas Kane for weeks, and hadn't even recognized him. Silas had changed, grown a beard, put on weight, and carried himself with an air of legitimacy. But the eyes... When Gideon thought back, he remembered the eyes. They were the same cold, calculating eyes of the man who had ridden away and left him to take the fall. He won't recognize me, Selene said, her voice dropping to a low, determined whisper. He never saw my face clearly, but I know his. I'll get close to him, and I'll find a way. It's a suicide mission, Gideon said, grabbing her arm. She tried to pull away, but he held fast. Listen to me. If you go after him like this, you'll end up just as dead as your husband. It's better than living as a ghost, she retorted, her voice breaking. Then we do it together, he said, the words coming from a place of pure instinct. She stared at him, her fury momentarily replaced by confusion. Together? You're the reason he got away. And I've lived with that every single day for 5 years, he said, his voice raw with a pain he had never shared with anyone. Maybe this is my chance to make it right. He doesn't know we know each other. He doesn't know we're married. He thinks I'm just another drifter. He thinks you're just some widow working in a hat shop. We can use that. A new kind of silence fell between them. The anger was still there, but beneath it, a sliver of something else emerged. A shared purpose, born of mutual ruin. They were two broken people, haunted by the same demon. And that demon was sleeping soundly a few hundred yards away, believing himself safe. Selene slowly pulled her arm from his grasp. She didn't run. She walked back to the table and sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping. How? She asked, the single word hanging in the air between them. The next morning, Gideon walked to the rail yard with a knot of ice in his stomach. Silas Kane, or Mr. Carver, as he called himself now, stood on the platform of the half-finished depot, shouting orders. He looked prosperous, confident, the kind of man who builds towns and has other men do the dying for him. Silas saw Gideon and waved him over with a wide, friendly smile. It was the same smile he'd used just before he'd shot that rancher. Ashford, just the man. Need you to run the timber count for the next run. Gideon just nodded, his hand clenching into a fist inside his pocket. Yes, sir. He spent the day working, every nerve on fire. He was playing a part, just like Selene. He was the simple, hard-working laborer. He watched Silas. He saw the way the other men respected him, the way the town councilmen deferred to him. Silas hadn't just built a new life, he'd built a fortress. Meanwhile, Selene put their plan into motion. She went to Mrs. Dobbins and spoke of her late husband, Calb, framing him as a good man led astray by a charismatic swindler. She named the swindler Silas Kane. She let her voice break. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mrs. Dobbins, the town's moral compass and chief gossip, was horrified. She promised to speak to her nephew, who worked in the land office. It was a small stone, tossed into a big pond, but they hoped the ripples would grow. That night, Selene and Gideon sat in their room, the door barred. They didn't speak of forgiveness or trust. They spoke of strategy. "He keeps his ledgers in the main office," Gideon said. "I saw him lock them in a safe." "The real ledgers," Selene mused. "Not the ones he shows the railroad company. If he cheated me, he's cheating them too." "We need proof," Gideon stated. "Something that can't be explained away. Something that will turn the town against him." The next few weeks were a quiet, agonizing torture. They lived a double life. In public, they were the Ashfords, a quiet, hard-working couple. In the privacy of their small room, they were conspirators, piecing together a case against a man who held all the power. Gideon learned that Silas was using railroad funds to buy up land under false names, knowing exactly where the tracks would be laid. He was building a personal empire on company money. Selene, through the town's network of wives and workers, discovered that Silas had a reputation for paying his workers in script that could only be redeemed at the company store he owned, trapping them in a cycle of debt. He was bleeding the whole town dry, and no one even knew it. One afternoon, Selene was walking home from the millinery when Silas's carriage pulled up beside her. Gideon was watching from the rail yard, his heart stopping in his chest. "Mrs. Ashford," Silas said, tipping his hat. His eyes roamed over her, a flicker of something ugly in their depths. "I hear you're a recent widow. My condolences." "Thank you, Mr. Carver," Selene said, her voice calm and steady. "It's a hard world for a woman alone," Silas continued, his voice slick with false sympathy. "If you ever need anything at all, my door is always open." He smiled and rode on. Selene stood frozen for a moment, then continued walking, her back ramrod straight. When she got back to the room, she sank into a chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "He looked at me," she whispered, her voice tight with revulsion. "And he didn't see a person. He saw a thing he could use." Gideon knelt in front of her and took her shaking hands in his. "We're going to get him, Selene," he said, his voice fierce. "We're going to burn his whole world to the ground." She looked at him then, and for the first time since the revelation, the anger in her eyes was gone. It was replaced by a shared, burning resolve. This was no longer just her fight. It was theirs. The moment came on a moonless night a week later. The railroad was hosting a reception for an investor from back east. It was the perfect opportunity. Silas would be at the hotel, playing the part of the respectable businessman. His office at the rail yard would be empty. "The safe is an old model," Gideon said, laying a set of tools on their small table. "I used to work as a smith's apprentice. I know these locks." "This is it," Selene said, her hand resting on the handle of a small, heavy pistol she had bought from a traveling merchant. "If this doesn't work—" "It will," he said, his voice more confident than he felt. "You get the ledgers, I'll keep watch. We meet back here." She nodded, her face pale but determined. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Gideon, if something happens—" "Nothing's going to happen," he said, cutting her off. He reached out and touched her cheek, a gesture so full of unspoken emotion that it made her breath catch. "We finish this together." He slipped out into the darkness first, a shadow moving through the back alleys of the town. He positioned himself in the lumber yard across from the depot office, his own pistol heavy in his hand. Minutes later, he saw another shadow detach itself from the darkness. Selene. She moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and beautiful. She picked the lock on the office door and disappeared inside. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every gust of wind, every distant dog bark sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He saw a light flicker inside the office. She was at the safe. Then he heard it. Footsteps, coming down the main road. Not the stumbling steps of a drunk, but the heavy, deliberate tread of a man with a purpose. A man was walking directly towards the depot office. Gideon's blood ran cold. He raised his pistol, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figure stepped into a patch of faint light from a distant saloon window. It wasn't Silas, it was the sheriff, and he was heading straight for the office where Selene was trying to crack the safe. Gideon had a split second to make a choice. If he stayed hidden, Selene would be caught. If he revealed himself, their whole plan would be exposed. He chose a third option. He stepped out from behind the lumber stack and fired his pistol into the air. The shot echoed through the silent town. Lights started appearing in windows. The sheriff spun around, his own gun drawn, and sprinted towards Gideon. "Drop it!" the sheriff yelled. Gideon threw his gun to the ground and raised his hands. "Just a misfire, Sheriff. Cleaning my pistol, it just went off." It was a weak story, but it was all he had. As the sheriff ran towards him shouting, Gideon glanced back at the depot office. The light inside was gone. The door was slightly ajar. Selene was gone. She'd gotten away. But as the sheriff slammed him against the wall of the lumber yard, Gideon knew he had just traded her freedom for his own. They threw him in the town's single jail cell, a cramped, stinking box at the back of the sheriff's office. He spent the night listening to the town settle back into a nervous quiet, his mind racing. Had Selene gotten the ledgers? Did she get away clean? Or was she out there, alone, with Silas still in power? The next morning, the sheriff brought him a tin cup of muddy coffee. "All right, Ashford, let's try this again. What were you doing at the rail yard last night?" "Like I said," Gideon repeated, his voice hoarse. "It was an accident." The sheriff wasn't a fool. "Funny kind of accident. Happened just as someone was breaking into your boss's office." Gideon's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "Mr. Carver reported it this morning. Said his safe was tampered with. Nothing was taken, but the lock was busted. He thinks one of his workers is trying to rob him. And then there's you, firing off your gun right outside. It doesn't look good, Ashford." "Nothing taken. That meant Selene had failed. She hadn't gotten the ledgers. And now, he was the prime suspect. Silas had him right where he wanted him." Later that day, Silas himself paid a visit. He stood outside the bars, looking down at Gideon with an expression of pity that was more insulting than any threat. "Gideon, Gideon, Gideon," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I take a chance on you, give you honest work, and this is how you repay me? I'm disappointed." "I didn't do anything," Gideon said through gritted teeth. "Of course you didn't," Silas said, his voice a low, confidential purr. "But you see my problem. The sheriff needs a culprit, and you were there. Unless you can give him someone else to look at." Gideon stared at him, the cold reality of the situation dawning on him. This wasn't just about a failed robbery. This was a trap. "Tell me who you were with, Gideon," Silas said, leaning closer. "Who else was there? Was it that pretty little wife of yours, the quiet one? I've seen the way she looks at me, like she knows something." He knew. Somehow he knew. Or he suspected. And he was using Gideon to confirm it. If Gideon stayed silent, he would rot in this jail. If he gave them Selene, he would be free. But he would lose the one thing he had left in the world that mattered. "Go to hell, Silas," Gideon whispered. Silas's friendly mask dropped. His eyes went cold and flat, the eyes of the killer Gideon remembered. "You'll have plenty of time to think about your decision," he hissed. "And while you're in here, I'll be sure to pay my respects to your grieving wife. Make sure she's not too lonely." The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. After Silas left, Gideon paced the tiny cell like a caged animal. He had failed. He had not only failed to protect Selene, he had led her into a trap, and then gotten himself caught in it. He was sitting with his head in his hands when he heard a commotion outside. It was Mrs. Dobbins's voice, loud and indignant, arguing with the deputy. The door opened and she marched in, her face set like granite. Selene was right behind her. Selene rushed to the bars of his cell. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. "I'm fine," he lied. "Did you get them?" She shook her head, her expression crumbling. "I couldn't open it. The lock was more complex than we thought. When I heard the shot, I ran." "It's my fault, Gideon," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I led you into this." "No," he said, reaching through the bars to touch her hand. "We walked into this together." Mrs. Dobbins cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "The sheriff has agreed to release you into my custody, Gideon Ashford," she announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I have vouched for your character and for your wife's. Mr. Carver may run the railroad, but I have lived in this town for 30 years. My word still carries some weight." She turned her stern gaze on Selene. "And you, child, you told me a story about a man who ruined your husband. I believe it's time the rest of the town heard that story as well." That evening, Mrs. Dobbins convened a meeting in the back room of her shop. She had gathered the town's most influential women, the banker's wife, the doctor's wife, the owner of the general store. Selene stood before them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, and she told them everything. She told them about Kansas, about the swindle, about how Silas Kane had destroyed her family and left her husband a broken, violent man. She didn't cry. She spoke with a quiet, powerful dignity that was more moving than any tears. Gideon stood in the corner of the room, watching. He saw the women's faces change from skepticism to sympathy, and then to a slow-burning anger. These were not powerless women. They were the keepers of the town's social fabric. They decided who was welcomed and who was shunned. When Selene finished, the banker's wife spoke. "My husband mentioned that Mr. Carver's accounts with the bank seemed unusual. Large sums of money being transferred to personal accounts out of state." The store owner nodded. "And that company script he pays the men with? He's charging them double the price for goods at his store. It's nothing short of robbery." The ripples were becoming a wave. Silas had built his fortress, but he'd forgotten that the foundations were the very people he was cheating. But it wasn't enough. They had suspicion, but no proof. The ledgers were still locked in Silas's safe, and Silas was not a man to sit back and let his empire crumble. The next day, 2 hired men with guns on their hips started following Selene wherever she went. A protective detail, Silas called it, a gift to his employee's wife while her husband was under investigation. Everyone knew what it really was. A threat, a message to her and to the whole town. That night, back in their room, the weight of it all pressed down on them. "He's boxing us in," Selene said, her voice strained. "He's daring us to make another move." Gideon looked at the tools still lying on the table. He looked at Selene's pale, determined face. The law couldn't touch Silas. The town was afraid of him. There was only one way left. "He thinks I'm locked up and you're terrified," Gideon said, a new, dangerous idea forming in his mind. "He's grown arrogant. He'll be at the saloon tonight, celebrating his victory." "What are you thinking?" Selene asked, her eyes searching his. "I'm thinking that I'm tired of running," he said, his voice low and hard. "I'm going to finish what I should have finished 5 years ago. I'm going to get those ledgers." "He'll kill you," she whispered. "Not if he doesn't see me coming." He explained the plan. It was reckless, desperate, and had 1,000 ways it could go wrong. But it was all they had. A little after midnight, a fire broke out in the stables behind the saloon. It wasn't a big fire, just a pile of hay and refuse, but it sent thick, black smoke billowing into the night sky. Just as Gideon had predicted, the saloon emptied out. Silas along with them, yelling orders and trying to organize a bucket brigade. That was the diversion. While the town was distracted, Gideon, who had slipped out of Mrs. Dobbins's back door, crept back to the depot office. This time he wasn't trying to be quiet. He used a crowbar he'd taken from the yard, the screech of metal on metal echoing in the empty street. He smashed the lock, pried open the door, and went straight for the safe. He didn't have the time or the skill to pick it. He had to move it. The safe was heavy, bolted to the floor, but Gideon was fueled by 5 years of shame and a desperate need to protect Selene. He put his back into the crowbar, the muscles in his shoulders screaming. The bolts groaned, splintered wood, and then gave way. He dragged the heavy iron box out of the office and onto a cart he had hidden in the alley. It was a race against time. The fire wouldn't distract them for long. He was hauling the cart down a back alley when he heard a voice from the shadows. "Need a hand with that?" Gideon spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. A figure stepped out of the darkness. It was the sheriff. But he wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a sledgehammer. "Mrs. Dobbins is a very persuasive woman," the sheriff said with a grim smile. "And I don't like being made a fool of in my own town. Let's get this thing open." They hauled the safe into the back of the smithy shop. The sheriff swung the sledgehammer, the clang of steel on steel ringing like a bell of judgment. The hinges buckled. The door groaned. With one final mighty swing, the lock shattered, and the door fell open. Inside were 2 sets of books, one, neat and orderly, for the railroad. The other, a mess of scribbled names and numbers, was Silas's real ledger. It detailed every bribe, every land swindle, every dollar he had stolen. And tucked inside the back cover was a deed. The deed to Selene's family farm in Kansas, signed over to a holding company owned by Silas Kane. They had it. They had the proof. Just as the sheriff held up the incriminating ledger, the doors to the smithy burst open. Silas stood there, his face a mask of fury, flanked by his 2 hired guns. The fire had been put out faster than Gideon had hoped. "I should have known," Silas spat, his eyes locking on Gideon. "I should have killed you back in the canyon." He raised his pistol. "It seems I have to clean up my own messes." But before he could fire, another figure stepped out from behind the forge. It was Selene, and she was holding her own pistol, its aim steady and true. "It's over, Silas," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of cold, hard steel. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You? A little farm girl from Kansas? You don't have the nerve." "You took my home," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "You took my husband's soul and turned him into a monster. You left me to die. You're wrong. I have nothing but nerve." A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Silas's gun or Selene's. It was the sheriff, who had drawn his own weapon and fired, hitting one of Silas's men in the shoulder. The man cried out and dropped his gun. The other gunman panicked, turning his pistol toward Selene. Gideon reacted without thinking. He launched himself forward, tackling the man to the ground. They wrestled for the gun, the deafening blast of it going off right next to Gideon's ear. Silas saw his chance. With everyone distracted, he turned his gun on the one person who could truly condemn him, Selene. But Gideon was faster. He rolled, came up with the gunman's pistol, and fired. The bullet caught Silas in the chest. He staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then up at Gideon. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle came out. He crumpled to the floor, his reign of deceit and ruin finally over. Silence fell in the smithy, broken only by the groans of the wounded man and the smell of gunpowder and hot metal. Gideon got to his feet, his ears ringing. He looked at Selene. She was still standing there, pistol held firmly in both hands, her eyes fixed on the body of the man who had haunted her for so long. She slowly lowered the gun, the tension draining out of her, leaving her looking small and fragile in the firelight. He crossed the room to her and gently took the pistol from her hands. He wrapped his arms around her and she collapsed against him, her body finally giving in to the years of fear and rage and grief. She sobbed into his chest, a storm of emotion finally breaking free. He just held her, his own heart aching with a mixture of relief and sorrow. It was over. The ghosts had been laid to rest. In the weeks that followed, the town of Tucson slowly pieced itself back together. The ledgers Gideon and the sheriff had recovered told the whole sordid story. The railroad company sent investigators, the corrupted land deals were nullified, and the money Silas had stolen was, as much as possible, returned to the people he'd cheated. Gideon and Selene became unlikely heroes, but they didn't want parades or praise. They wanted peace. One morning, Gideon found Selene on the small plot of land Silas had given them. She was kneeling in the dirt, a handful of seeds in her palm. The frame of the house they had planned to build stood like a skeleton against the rising sun. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt. A real smile, a true and easy smile, lit up her eyes. "I'm planting a garden," she said. "I think things will grow here now." He knelt beside her and took her hand, the seeds pressing into his palm. He looked at her, the woman he'd found half dead in the desert, the woman who had lied to him, fought beside him, and saved his life. The woman he loved. "The deed to your family's farm was in the safe," he said quietly. "It's yours again. We could go back." She shook her head, her eyes never leaving his. "That place is full of ghosts. Our home. It's here." She gestured to the bare ground, to the unfinished frame. "We built this, not with wood and nails, but with surviving. We earned it." He knew she was right. Their foundation wasn't built on lies or revenge anymore. It was built on something stronger, a hard-won truth, a shared redemption. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that tasted of dust and sunlight and new beginnings. They had both been lost, wandering in their own deserts, but they had found each other, and in the ruins of their pasts, they were finally ready to build a future. They stayed. They built the house, board by board. They planted the garden, and in time, the sound of children's laughter filled the rooms. They had faced down the worst parts of themselves and the world, and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. Together. It just goes to show you that sometimes the person you save is the one who ends up saving you right back. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption in the Old West, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what other secrets are buried out there in the dust.